The birth of American Anglicanism was an agonizing paradox. It was an Episcopal Church that thrived for 2 centuries without a single bishop, an arm of the British crown in a wild frontier, and a tradition that bound its clergy to royal prayers even as patriot muskets lined the chapel doors. When the fires of the Revolution cleared, the newly christened Episcopal Church found itself stripped of state funding, abandoned by leaders, and deeply loathed as a bastion of British tyranny. Survival demanded a complete reinvention, fusing ancient apostolic order with modern republican representation. Yet this hard-won stability was merely the calm before a greater storm. By severing its ties to the crown, the American church unleashed its internal factions to battle for its very soul, setting the stage for a century of fierce theological civil war. The traditions of evangelical pietism, high church sacramentalism, and Anglo-Catholic revivalism did not merely coexist. They actively jockeyed for dominance, establishing rival seminaries and advancing divergent missionary methodologies. The growth of autonomous provinces across North America, including the distinct structural evolution of Canadian Anglicanism, mirrored the broader expansion of global missionary networks, catalyzing the formation of the global Anglican Communion. The introduction of radical revisions to traditional understandings of holy orders and human sexuality fractured the global body. Today, the Anglican landscape in North America stands deeply realigned, caught between a liberalized establishment and a burgeoning traditionalist counter-movement. The internal life of the 19th century Episcopal Church was characterized by a profound tripolar theological tension that permanently altered its institutional DNA, functioning as an umbrella for distinct factions: evangelicals, high churchmen, and later, broad church liberals. The first major force was evangelical Anglicanism, indebted to the 18th century revivals. For American evangelicals, the center of gravity was the individual experience of conversion and justification by faith alone. Evangelicals minimized liturgical precision, viewing the true church as an invisible fellowship. This dictated an eager willingness to cooperate with non-Anglican Protestant denominations in missionary enterprises and social reform. In direct opposition stood the High Church movement, viewing pan-Protestant cooperation as a dangerous dilution. For them, the Christian life was anchored objectively in the visible church and the grace of holy baptism. The cornerstones of high church theology were apostolic succession and ministerial authority, maintaining that the episcopate was an essential component of the church's divine constitution, linking it directly to the apostles. This polarization manifested in rival institutional ecosystems. The High Church Party found its home at the General Theological Seminary in New York, while the evangelicals established the Virginia Theological Seminary. A precise parallel occurred within Canadian Anglicanism, where the High Church Trinity College stood in sharp institutional and theological contrast to the evangelical Wycliffe College, institutionalizing the divide. The mid-19th century witnessed an intensification of these tensions with the arrival of the Oxford movement from England, which advanced a radical recovery of the Church's Catholic heritage and sacramental theology. When these ideas crossed the Atlantic, they catalyzed Anglo-Catholicism, causing institutional trauma. The movement's critique of the Reformation provoked panic, escalating into highly publicized ecclesiastical trials of bishops. The theological crisis deepened when several prominent clergy seceded to the Roman Catholic Church. The most shocking defection was Levi Silliman Ives, the sitting bishop of North Carolina, whose conversion sent shockwaves. Despite departures, Anglo-Catholicism transformed the landscape, fueling a massive revival of Gothic architecture and advanced ceremonialism, including vestments, incense, and altar candles, which migrated into mainstream worship. The escalation of ritualism pushed the evangelical wing to a breaking point. In 1773, George David Cummins, assistant bishop of Kentucky, believing the church was drifting toward sacerdotalism, led a group out of the denomination. In 1874, this exiting faction established the Reformed Episcopal Church. The REC sought to preserve a Protestant liturgy stripped of any language implying baptismal regeneration or the physical real presence. By provoking the departure of its most articulate evangelical leaders, the Episcopal Church lost its internal equilibrium, leaving the field open to be reshaped by high churchmen, Anglo-Catholics, and broad church liberals. A third voice gained prominence: broad church liberalism, which sought to engage with modern intellectual trends. A foundational manifesto was the Memorial, presented by William Augustus Muhlenberg, advocating liturgical flexibility. This broad church ecumenical impulse found its definitive expression in the Chicago-Lambeth Quadrilateral of 1886, formulated as an explicit proposal distilling the essence of Catholic order and Protestant liberty. The Quadrilateral perfectly embodied late 19th century Anglicanism, attempting to position the Episcopal Church as a unique bridge church capable of uniting the Catholic and Protestant worlds. While the American Church navigated these divisions, Canadian Anglicanism underwent a parallel evolution. Between 1839 and 1854, a series of legislative decisions systematically stripped the Canadian Church of state funding. Forced to rely on their own resources, Canadian Anglicans pioneered models of church self-government, successfully petitioning for the legal recognition of diocesan synods that uniquely included lay representation. Expanding westward, this body eventually made a complete psychological break from the mother country, formally changing its name to the Anglican Church of Canada in 1955, entering the 20th century thoroughly tested by internal fires. The transformation of Anglicanism from a localized Anglo-American institution into a sprawling global communion represents a complex historical process driven by missionary zeal, colonial expansion, and a shifting understanding of interdependence. In the United States, expansion was systematically formalized by the General Convention of 1835, which declared that the church itself was the primary missionary society and that every baptized member was intrinsically a member. This shift introduced the missionary bishop sent out into the frontier as the primary catalyst to plant congregations and establish the institutional framework from scratch. Figures like Jackson Kemper became instrumental across the American West. A parallel dynamic unfolded within Canadian Anglicanism, deeply intertwined with the geopolitical realities of British North America and enterprises like the Hudson's Bay Company, where missionaries traveled alongside traders. The establishment of the Diocese of Rupert's Land in 1849 served as a vital base for extensive missionary outreach to indigenous populations and emerging settlements. As the Canadian Pacific Railway pushed westward in the late 19th century, the Church followed the tracks, establishing dioceses in rapid succession to firmly implant Anglican structures from the Atlantic to the Pacific. On the global stage, the expansion of Anglicanism was inextricably bound up with the growth of the British Empire. As British colonial authority expanded, the Church of England accompanied the imperial apparatus. Initially, colonial chaplains provided spiritual care to British personnel. However, the creation of the colonial episcopate, accelerated by the Colonial Bishoprics Fund in 1841, fundamentally altered this dynamic. Bishops were dispatched to colonial capitals, transforming chaplaincies into permanent diocesan structures. Indigenous populations increasingly adapted the liturgy and theology, laying the groundwork for leadership that would outgrow paternalism. The inevitable decline of direct British imperial control throughout the late 19th and 20th centuries necessitated a radical legal restructuring of these colonial dioceses. The solution was the development of the autonomous province. Through legal precedents, dioceses organized into self-governing national churches, independent of the Church of England, yet choosing full communion with Canterbury. This marked the birth of the modern Anglican Communion, a voluntary association of distinct, self-governing national churches bound together by shared history and instruments of mutual affection rather than legal coercion. The primary instrument and the focus of unity for the entire communion is the Archbishop of Canterbury, recognized as the primus inter pares, or first among equals, among the world's Anglican primates. The second instrument is the Lambeth Conference, first convened by Archbishop Charles Longley in 1867 in response to a request from Canadian bishops who desired a global council to address pressing theological controversies. Meeting roughly every 10 years, the Lambeth Conference gathers all active bishops from across the globe. The resolutions passed at Lambeth carry profound moral and theological weight, though they lack the force of canon law. The third instrument, the Primates Meeting, was established in 1978 by Archbishop Donald Coggan to provide an opportunity for regular, nimble consultation among the senior archbishops of the various provinces. This body was designed to address urgent administrative and theological crises that might arise between the decennial Lambeth conferences. The fourth instrument is the Anglican Consultative Council, created in 1968. Distinct from the others, the ACC includes representation not only from bishops, but also from priests, deacons, and laypersons elected by each province. This council focuses on practical coordination in areas of mission, ecumenism, and social justice, ensuring that the voice of the laity is integrated into the global governance structure. Together, these four instruments were intended to bind the communion together through bonds of affection, relying on mutual respect and shared theological inheritance rather than legal coercion. The middle and late decades of the 20th century witnessed a profound internal transformation within North American Anglicanism, shifting the focus to a radical renegotiation of how the church worshiped and engaged with the modern landscape. For nearly 4 centuries, Anglican identity was defined by the phrase lex orandi, lex credendi, the law of prayer is the law of belief. However, mid-century biblical scholarship and patristic retrieval catalyzed the liturgical movement. This movement sought to recover the practices of the early church, shifting the focus of Sunday worship from morning prayer to the Holy Eucharist, culminating in the authorization of the 1979 Book of Common Prayer. The 1979 revision introduced a radical paradigm shift, modernizing language, elevating holy baptism to a primary public sacrament, and repositioning the altar to allow the priest to face the congregation for a participatory atmosphere. Despite scholarly acclaim, the 1979 book provoked intense resistance. For many traditionalists, the abandonment of Cranmerian language and shifts regarding the Eucharistic sacrifice represented a betrayal of classic identity. The implementation caused significant pastoral disruption and served as a primary catalyst for the continuing church movement, which sought to preserve the 1928 liturgy and traditional theology in independent jurisdictions. Simultaneously, the Episcopal Church was forced to confront its historical complicity in systemic racial injustice. Long caricatured as the Republican Party at prayer due to its wealthy membership, the church possessed a complex record. While many leaders historically favored stability, a powerful countercurrent asserted itself. Figures like Jonathan Daniels, an Episcopal seminarian, traveled south and was brutally martyred in Alabama in 1965 while shielding a young black activist. The General Convention enacted progressive resolutions culminating in the special program launched by presiding Bishop John Hines in 1967. Channeling significant financial resources directly to self-determination projects in marginalized Black communities. The momentum of social liberation extended to gender equity. The push for the ordination of women reached a flashpoint on July 29, 1974, when 3 retired bishops defied canon law and ordained 11 women to the priesthood. Throwing the church into a canonical tailspin, the General Convention of 1976 voted to formally alter the canons to permit the ordination of women to all 3 orders of ministry, retroactively regularizing the ordinations. Convinced the church had broken from apostolic order, a substantial coalition of traditionalists gathered in 1977 at the Congress of St. Louis, issuing a manifesto rejecting the ordination of women and the 1979 prayer book. The trajectory toward gender inclusivity continued, reaching another milestone in 1989 with the consecration of Barbara Harris as suffragan Bishop of Massachusetts, making her the first woman bishop in the communion. The Anglican Church of Canada followed a very similar path, ordaining its first women priests in 1976 and consecrating its first female bishop, Victoria Matthews, in 1994. By the final decades of the 20th century, leadership was increasingly dominated by a progressive theological methodology, finding its most articulate and controversial exponent in John Shelby Spong, Bishop of Newark. Spong utilized his platform to advocate for a radical re-theologizing of Christianity, discarding traditional doctrines like the virgin birth and the bodily resurrection, arguing they were pre-modern myths. This progressive framework inevitably focused on the ethical evaluation of human sexuality. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, grassroots movements pushed for the full inclusion and affirmation of LGBT Christians. Traditionalists countered this momentum by appealing to the consistent witness of Scripture and the explicit resolutions of the Global Communion, most notably Resolution 110 of the 1998 Lambeth Conference. This resolution stated that homosexual practice was incompatible with Scripture and advised against the legitimizing of same-sex unions, establishing a profound global standard. The domestic leadership, however, viewed this through the lens of civil rights and baptismal equality, setting the stage for an unprecedented institutional crisis that would shatter the structural unity of the communion. The latent theological, anthropological, and hermeneutical tensions finally erupted into an institutional civil war at the dawn of the 21st century. The flashpoint was the choice by North American dioceses to bypass global consensus, permanently transforming the domestic ecclesiastical landscape. The tipping point occurred during the General Convention of the Episcopal Church in the summer of 2003. The convention formally consented to the historic election of Gene Robinson as the bishop coadjutor of the Diocese of New Hampshire. Robinson was an openly gay man living in a committed, non-celibate relationship. This decision was a direct, explicit challenge to the moral framework affirmed by the global episcopate at Lambeth 5 years prior. The consecration of Robinson in November 2003 sent immediate shockwaves through the global Anglican communion. The response from the global South, the rapidly growing, highly conservative provinces of Africa, Asia, and South America, was immediate and fierce. Primates representing tens of millions of Anglicans declared that the Episcopal Church had officially broken communion. They argued that the leadership was introducing a false gospel that fractured the visible unity of Christ's church. In an attempt to manage the escalating crisis, the Archbishop of Canterbury appointed an international commission. This global panel produced the definitive Windsor Report in 2004 to address the fracturing body. The document called for a strict moratorium on the consecration of bishops in same-sex relationships. It also suggested creating an Anglican communion covenant to bind provinces to a shared disciplinary framework. However, the proposed covenant ultimately failed to gain widespread adoption across the international provinces. Progressive dioceses viewed it as a threat to autonomy, while traditionalists deemed it too weak to enforce orthodoxy. Traditionalist parishes and entire dioceses began to seek ways to sever their ties with their parent denominations. They looked for paths out of the establishment without losing their wider, global Anglican identity. This deep structural migration was actively facilitated by the intervention of vibrant global South primates. They exercised cross-border jurisdictions, taking American and Canadian parishes under their direct spiritual oversight. This fragmented traditionalist diaspora was eventually unified into a single cohesive alternative structure. In 2008, a massive international gathering of traditionalist leaders convened in Jerusalem for the first GAFCON. This historic global assembly issued the foundational Jerusalem Declaration as its core document. The manifesto firmly affirmed the supreme authority of Scripture, the creeds, and traditional moral theology. Crucially, GAFCON provided the global backing necessary for the launch of a new domestic jurisdiction. In June 2009, the Anglican Church in North America, or ACNA, was formally established. This province successfully united former Episcopalians, Canadian Anglicans, and members of the Reformed Episcopal Church. They brought various missionary networks under a single provincial umbrella with Robert Duncan as primate. The classic establishment prioritized progressive adaptation and the prioritization of lived experience. In stark contrast, the ACNA anchored its identity in strict adherence to classical biblical orthodoxy. Holy matrimony became fully egalitarian with the liturgical blessing of same-sex unions in older structures. The ACNA defined marriage strictly as the lifelong union between one man and one woman. While the older bodies remained aligned with traditional European structures and the historic See of Canterbury, the ACNA stood deeply aligned with the massive demographic of the Global South and GAFCON. The creation of the ACNA provided a refuge for traditionalists, but historical party tensions remained. The province operates as a complex coalition, including strict Anglo-Catholics, classic evangelicals, and charismatics. The most pressing internal challenge facing the ACNA remains the question of the ordination of women. Anglo-Catholic dioceses refuse to recognize these orders, leading to an ongoing negotiation of shared communion. Global South leaders have explicitly stated they can no longer recognize Canterbury as the true focus of unity. The historical model of global unity based on voluntary bonds of affection is rapidly fracturing. The legacy of the Anglican in America proves that the Church has always been a house negotiated, pulled between ancient order and modern transformation. As the structural lines continue to crack and realign across the globe, every believer is left standing at a historical crossroads. The choices made today will permanently map the terrain of faith for generations to come. As you look at this fractured landscape, do you believe Anglicanism's ultimate survival relies on adapting to cultural evolution or anchoring firmly to historic orthodoxy? Can a global church family truly endure when its foundational bonds of affection are broken? Where do you see the center of spiritual gravity shifting next? If you want to continue uncovering the deep stories, forgotten histories, and profound theological battles that shape our modern world, make sure to support our work. Hit the like button, share your perspective in the comments below, and subscribe to Theology Today to never miss an episode in this journey through the history of faith.